Sort of to explain a little bit about like nutrient digestion and how sort of protein, carbohydrates and fat get stored as body fat, and why it's probably a good idea to actually be tracking macros and not just following overall calories. So here's like a bit of an overview about, so in the top row these are our macros and then how they get stored as fat. So we have triglyceride synthesis from dietary fat, and then palmitate, which is our storage from carbohydrate and protein. So looking at carbohydrate, for it to get stored as body fat, just one thing I want to point out, carbohydrate and protein, they don't actually have a direct pathway to get stored as body fat. So there's no way that they can, well technically there is, it's called de novo lipogenesis, but in humans it doesn't really happen that much, whereas fat can get stored directly as fat. Now carbohydrate, for it to get stored as fat, it has to get converted to pyruvate. So glucose gets converted to pyruvate, pyruvate goes on to acetyl-CoA. Acetyl-CoA enters the TCA cycle, and it has to then leave the TCA cycle and get reformed in, because this happens in the mitochondria, and this is where we need in the cytoplasm, which is where fatty acid synthesis takes place. So to get acetyl-CoA out of the mitochondria, it enters the TCA cycle, it joins with something called oxaloacetate, forms citrate, it gets transported out into acetyl-CoA again, and then from there it goes on to something called malonyl-CoA, and then it gets stored as fat in fatty acid synthesis through this pathway. Now there's a lot of like gaps in between there of different steps, but I don't think it's really that important. Protein has probably even a further roundabout effect, because the way that it gets stored as fat is, the thing with protein is it has an amino group, which is this group here, it's the nitrogen. So the protein then into amino acids, it has to lose its amino group, and the carbon skeleton, so the stuff that actually gets oxidized, then actually goes on into acetyl-CoA, fed into the TCA cycle, similar pathway, and then goes down to palmitate. These two steps here is how we oxidize energy. So this is how we get energy from these macros. This is how we store it. Whereas now if you look at fat, it has a direct pathway. So fat gets digested, so you eat fat, it gets reformed into what's called a chylomicron, which is basically just a way that fat can get transported in the body, because fat is fat soluble and enzymes are water soluble, so it needs to join with something. That's basically all that is how we store it. It gets transported over to the liver, and the liver can store it directly in TG synthesis, just triglyceride synthesis. So that's sort of an overview of how they get stored as fat. And the other thing is, probably what makes most sense for an athlete is, a lot of people will say as long as you hit overall calories, you'll be fine. And I think for the most part that's probably true, because that will ultimately dictate energy balance. But if you're looking for like optimal performance, I think that's one thing that many people neglect is performance, because we are athletes. So the primary fuel source we use is carbohydrates. So if you're getting a diet of, say, example, 1,000 calories, just to use an even number, and you're getting that all from fat, you're probably neglecting performance more so than if you were to have a more balanced split, or maybe one that even favors carbohydrate. So I generally like to have carbohydrates a little bit higher for athletes, and the same with protein. I'll generally have protein a little bit higher than it may need to be, for reasons that I probably won't go into in here. And the other thing I wanted to mention is the way that we store, say, fat over carbohydrate or protein, or vice versa, is the body will primarily oxidize what we put into it. So if we're fed a very high carbohydrate diet, we'll primarily oxidize carbohydrates and use those as energy. And then incoming dietary fats will then go on and get stored. Whereas if we were eating a diet primarily fat, we're going to oxidize mostly fats, and it sort of works like that. So the way that we will store body fat, because these two don't happen much unless we're in like an overall excess. And the way that we will store fat if these two are in excess is that if we're oxidizing these two primarily, because what we feed in, like I said, is what we oxidize most. So if we're oxidizing these two for energy, then that leaves this to get stored as fat, because fat can get stored directly as fat. So that's sort of like an overview of why I think it's important to not just track overall calories, but probably have a bit of a structured approach to your macros, instead of just going at it without any thought to it, because we are athletes, and I think there is a role for each macro. Fat's primarily hormonal, protein obviously repair, and that's another thing with protein, that has a higher thermic effect. So you actually have to get protein down to this stage, it actually requires more energy than if you're going from, say, carbohydrates to this stage. How much of an effect it has is probably not overly significant, but I think especially in the later stages of prep for like dieting bodybuilders, when you're trying to get that last bit out, I think that's probably an important aspect to think about, because it is notable. It's probably not too noticeable in, let's say, your average person at like 12% body fat, but I think there is merit to that. So this video wasn't to, hope it didn't confuse you too much, but I just wanted to give you sort of an overview of how macros get digested and how they end up as fats, or how they're oxidized. So try have a little bit more structure to your diet. If you're an athlete, you might want to favor carbohydrates a little more. Keep protein up. Maybe, like I said, I like it a bit higher than what most people will recommend. I generally am around 1.2 grams per pound. And then fat is obviously needed for hormonal benefits, as well as other stuff like regulating blood glucose, satiety. There's a lot of roles for fat, but I just think most people that follow a generic calorie diet and then won't really give any notice to macros and won't, acknowledge their importance, will tend to eat mostly fat because it's easier to get in. But yeah, just wanted to put this out to sort of give you guys a brief overview on it, and I hope you guys enjoyed it. Thanks.